So, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for some of you, good evening. A very warm welcome to you to today's panel, which I'm delighted to chair. My name's Antonia Mulvey, and I am the Executive Director of Legal Action Worldwide. And a huge thanks to our co-hosts, the Bangladesh Embassy, to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, and particularly to Ambassador Rahman. Now, we have a fantastic panel lined up today. We'll have Yasmin Ullah speaking, Dr. Priya Pillai, Mr. Nicholas Kumjian, and Ambassador Hack. I think many of you will know the speakers today. And, you know, we were thinking, well, why now? Why should we have this panel now? I'm sure many of you will be aware that, of course, last month, we marked 5 years since the 2017 clearance operations. And also, of course, in Geneva, the Human Rights Council 51st session is about to commence in the next few weeks. And as we were marking 5 years last month, we were looking and working with many victims, survivors from the 2016 and 2017 clearance operations and asking them, what do they want? What is it that they're seeking? And of course, many of them are saying what they said back then, 5 or 6 years ago. They want to return home. They want to go back to Myanmar. But they have to return to Myanmar, of course, with equal rights. They want their citizenship. They want to return home with their rights protected in a dignified, safe, and voluntary manner. But let us have no mistake, this is what they are asking for. And we work with hundreds of Rohingya still in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. But then let us turn to the issue of, has there been any progress in this issue? Is the environment conducive for their return? And what can we do to assist that? And that's really why we are here today. And I can't think of a better panel to discuss this issue. And I will be taking away the key points that come out of this and circulating them, because I think it's so very important. And I'm going to be asking panelists, and I want you to think about it. What can member states do? What can the UN do? What can civil society do more? And I think that here we have an intersection, that the right to return, but what does international justice and the accountability efforts play in that? And that's also what we're going to be talking about. I think it's really very important, this intersection, not only for the Rohingya, but also for those within Myanmar, the Burmese, as we've seen since the coup last year, and the violations which are most likely amounting to international crimes that are continuing and very concerning for all of us within Myanmar. Of course, a number of steps have already been undertaken in international justice. A full investigation by the International Criminal Court is underway. And as we all are aware, the International Court of Justice case of Gambia versus Myanmar on the breach of the Genocide Convention. And of course, only last month, the UK announced their intention to intervene on that case. So there is some progress, but is it enough, and what more can be undertaken? I would say to you that time is not on our side. We know from other situations that the longer that people are away from their country, the more difficult it is for them to return. So we want to see action. So I can't think of anybody better to open up this panel, and I'm going to turn to you, Ambassador Rahman. If those of you who don't know him, of course, he is the ambassador for the in the Bangladesh Embassy in Geneva. Very sad to hear that you might be leaving there soon, but very pleased that you are joining and co-hosting the panel. Over to you for opening remarks. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and distinguished speakers and my colleagues from different missions and international organizations. A good afternoon, and I thank you all for participating in this webinar. Let me begin my opening remarks by thanking the Legal Action Worldwide for co-hosting the event with us, and all our distinguished panelists for joining from different corners of the world to this event. Distinguished audience, you know the history, yet I would like to say a few words to refresh our memory. As the chair said, 5 years back in 2017, more than 700,000 Rohingyas fled to Bangladesh to escape massacre and atrocities unleashed on them by the Myanmar military in the Rakhine state. In that very critical moment, Bangladesh had only two choices. One, to open the adjacent border with Myanmar in order to save the lives of millions of people. And the other was to close the border, which might have created a gruesome history of ethnic cleansing. But our Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, chose the first option. She upheld humanity and allowed these persecuted people take temporary shelter in Bangladesh. Currently, over 1.1 million forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals who identify themselves as Rohingyas, which is very important, are staying in Bangladesh, and that include the members from earlier influx. Distinguished participants, the Rohingya community members have been living in Myanmar for several hundred years. Myanmar is their homeland. There cannot be any doubt about that. However, the Burma Citizenship Act 1982 didn't acknowledge the Rohingyas as an ethnic minority of Myanmar. At present, while 135 ethnic communities are enjoying their citizenship right, the Rohingyas have been denied the same. Their exclusion from the constitutional rights made them targets of state-sponsored oppression and torture. Then several crackdown operations were carried out upon them by the Tatmadaw at different times. Most of you are well aware of that. This systemic discrimination and torture earned them the recognition of the UN as the most persecuted ethnic minority in the world. It's very important. Indeed, the Rohingya crisis is one of the gravest humanitarian crises of the present century. Bangladesh is trying its best with the support of international community to provide all sorts of humanitarian services, including food, shelter, security, basic healthcare services, along with learning and skill development facilities. As you know, a small country of only 148,000 square kilometers and a population of more than 165 million. It is being increasingly difficult for us to continue to host them and ensure the essential services to them. Understandably, the prolonged stay of the Rohingyas poses enormous challenges to our limited resources and capacities, and thus to our development endeavors. Colleagues, the Rohingya problem originated in Myanmar, and its solution lies there. Bangladesh wants a durable solution to this crisis. Rohingyas are the nationals of Myanmar, and they aspire to return to their homeland with safety and dignity. Sustainable repatriation appears to be the best solution to this crisis. However, the Rohingyas must have the confidence that there would be no further repression, or they would not be targeted for another round of violence after they return home. We have always emphasized safe, voluntary, and dignified repatriation of the Rohingyas to Myanmar. This is the expectation of the international community also. However, sustainable repatriation requires political will on the part of Myanmar. They have to be sincere about it. In the past few occasions, Myanmar took back, I think in 1978, roughly 200,000, and in 1992, roughly 230,000. We had expected that this time also, they will take their nationals back after the so-called security situation settles down. Unfortunately, this is not the case up until now. Despite the utmost sincerity from the Bangladesh side, not a single Rohingya could be returned to Myanmar yet. We firmly believe that dialogue is the most effective means to resolve this dispute. Accordingly, we wished that discussion and dialogue will help settle this protracted crisis. Bangladesh signed 3 instruments with Myanmar after the influx of Rohingyas in 2017. Now our distinguished speaker, Mr. Shahidullah, witnesses all this himself. Unfortunately, Myanmar is yet to comply with provisions of the bilateral instruments. This has been in line with our commitment to and pledges to the international community and to the United Nations. Last year, Myanmar proposed to restart discussion on repatriation. 2 meetings were held virtually, one technical level meeting on expediting the verification of the past residences of the Rohingyas, and the other, the joint working group meeting for repatriation. Detailed discussions were held to start repatriation with a select group of Rohingyas whose successful resettlement in their homes would have created necessary confidence among other Rohingyas to repatriate. In addition, we had shared a list of around 5,500 Rohingyas to start repatriation through the bilateral agreement. We are eagerly waiting to see that Myanmar takes this initiative seriously and act accordingly. And for that, we need continuous pressure from the international community on Myanmar. We welcome the China-led initiative described as a tripartite effort. The Chinese Prime Minister visited Bangladesh in August and assured us of their continued support to initiate the repatriation process. We are seeking support from India in this regard as well. We are also engaged with ASEAN and others to facilitate repatriation. While the United Nations and the members of the international community are focused on the restoration of democracy in Myanmar, which is something we also support, the plight of the Rohingyas should not be overlooked. We expect the ASEAN countries, with their leverage vis-à-vis Myanmar, to take a strong position in favor of the implementation of the recommendation by the Kofi Annan Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, which will create a pathway for citizenship of Rohingyas in the future, which all Rohingyas aspire to have and to be. Distinguished audience, and I'm concluding soon, continued uncertainty about repatriation are causing frustration among the Rohingyas, which is palpable when we go and visit and meet them in Cox's Bazar. They are undertaking perilous maritime journeys. This is adding further complexities to the crisis. Also, the prolonged stay in Bangladesh without the prospect of repatriation may cause substantial security threats and create the ground for regional instability, human trafficking, radicalization, etc., etc. Bangladesh is ready to engage with any entity, work within any forum, bilateral, trilateral, or multilateral, to realize the goal of sustainable repatriation. The Rohingyas have the inalienable right to return to their homeland. We all should strive to keep their hope of return alive until a just solution is found. And I'll stop here, and I look forward to hearing from our distinguished speakers with insights and suggestions on repatriation and resolving the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for those excellent remarks, and of course reminding us that their plight should not be forgotten, and that is also why we are here today. And now I want to turn to Yasmin Ullah. I think, you know, a Rohingya activist, probably everybody knows who she is, who's joined us very early in the morning. We're very grateful, Yasmin. Now, we just heard from the ambassador that Myanmar is the homeland of the Rohingya, and indeed Legal Action Worldwide, we represent hundreds of Rohingya in their quest for international justice. And all those that we represent and also advise, they say they want to go home. And I mentioned this earlier, if the right conditions are met, they want to return home. Yasmin, is their sentiment, what we are hearing, is that representative of the broader community? Can you tell us more? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Antonia, and thank you, the ambassador, for that remark. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to partake in this discussion with you all today. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging that I speak with you all today from an unceded traditional territories of the Semiahmoo, Katzie, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Musqueam, Kakate, Tsleil-Waututh, Tsawwassen First Nations, and other Coast Salish people. Unceded means that the lands were never surrendered or given up, and thus I and others are operating on a stolen land. Let me first begin by thanking the Permanent Mission of Bangladesh to the United Nations in Geneva and Law for organizing this important panel on repatriation of Rohingya in the context of the current crisis. It was just yesterday that I received a very disturbing report of what happened within Myanmar. 19 Rohingya minors among 65 Rohingya were recently arrested in Bogale, sentenced to prison to 2 years. Among 70 Rohingya where, they were on the journey to Malaysia by boat, 5 of them died due to hunger and dehydration in the process. This is an important precedent to discuss, I think, when it comes to any consideration of Rohingya to return. And to answer your question, Antonia, yes, this is a sentiment that is shared across the community. We all are aware that we belong to Rakhine State or Arakan, our homeland, and that's where we want to go back. Given that the conditions of safety, voluntary dignity, and sustainability is met. My first concern about repatriation at this point is that the conditions of safety should take priority over any other conditions at this moment in time. While the civil movement, the civil disobedience movement and other democratic movement is still trying to eradicate the Myanmar military's power and its existing grasp on the structure of social, economic, and political landscape is still ongoing. In my humble opinion, no Rohingya should be repatriated back to Myanmar at this point. Not until the risk factors, especially the precursors of genocide and other mass atrocity, are still present. This includes the ever-present and pervasive policy that led to the genocide itself, which, is continuing, as I've mentioned earlier, of the 65 people and 70 people that were arrested and sentenced to 2 years jail. It's the penalization of the mobility that continues on. Over the past, from the beginning of this year alone, there have been many hundreds of Rohingya who have been arrested and put to 2 years jail. Currently, Myanmar military rule continues to spout nonsense like needing to make sure that Rohingya go through the process of national verification. And a very important note is that during the siege, alone, during the past 2 years, the military continues to discriminate and abuse Rohingya, especially in the case of vaccine apartheid, where Rohingya aren't allowed to gain access to COVID-19 vaccinations, among many other vaccinations and health programs. So safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable in this sense should not only be defined at the top level, but also be filtered through the lens of the community being fully informed on the matters involving their lives, on the matters that involve their returns and its risks, and the current situations within Myanmar under siege. Yes, the community should have a say within, when and how they should return, but as far as prevention of atrocity crimes goes, we need to bear in mind that Rohingya are one of the most underprivileged group of people in the world, with lack of access to education, continuous lack of access to education, might I add, and resources, for a very long time. Therefore, in order to make an informed decision, to lead to voluntary part, there needs to be an entire process to ensure that no stone is left unturned and no one from the community is lacking in their understanding of the current risk and conditions. What I would like to propose is that Rohingya living in the camps should be able to explore trainings, vocational trainings, works within the confine of the camps. I'm not asking for any more than this in order to help meet issues of dwindling funds. That is only going to worsen as the international community will continue to move on to other issues. It is important to note that I'm not letting the international community off the hook here. It is, after all, the international neglect that put Rohingya in this circumstance in the first place. So it would require the international community to hold itself accountable and continue to hold its grasp on the humanitarian conditions well, so that the burden does not all fall onto Bangladesh, who have generously opened their doors and opened their arms to help us. We hope that the Bangladesh would not be pushed to make decisions to have to push Rohingya to go back without all these conditions met, as previously mentioned. Rohingya are not the people without skills, and I've reiterated this many times. I would like to reiterate it again. And you might be bored of this by now, but Rohingya being able to survive for this long is because of our survival skills. We're not people without skills. There are much more potential that should be explored, especially in helping creating more stable conditions within the camps. As long as there is willingness from all parties to listen to our community and applying those, advice that we give, consult with us and actually let us use those skills to develop, these skills further. Without that, it would actually inhibit us from being able to return as contributing members of the society, and that will actually hold us back. That will create potential risk for us to actually having to be back in Bangladesh or other countries in the region again. So if we do not prepare Rohingya to be able to reintegrate with conditions of safety, dignity, and voluntary met, we actually risk Rohingya being back in Bangladesh and other countries again in the region. This is a prime opportunity, if I can say so, for us to actually work with the community, especially in bringing in diaspora and all of these other groups, in helping to inform the community, create a sense of agency within the camps, because that is what's dwindling and what's lacking. From what I've heard from the accounts that of my colleagues, it is important to ensure that Rohingya feel as whole as they could be, in order to prepare them to eventually go back and be not only be able to go back as these victims of mass atrocity, beaten and downtrodden, but really full, wholesome human being with agency to change what is needed in terms of the structural policies, in terms of our lack of access to resources, our lack of political representation, and our fight in needing to ensure that we have a place within Myanmar, in terms of our ethnic communities having agency as a collectivist society. So all of this combined would actually need a lot of preparation. It would not just be a 1 day or 2 day process to ensure that Rohingya go back and never have to return, or never have to seek help again. It would require a lot more listening. It would require a lot more preparation and continuous work with the community ourselves. So I would like to end with that, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, and for also reminding us of the deterring situation in Myanmar, but also what is needed in Bangladesh. And also, you thanked Bangladesh for hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees. Now, I just want to ask you one very brief question. It's a rather long question, but brief answer. What changes would need to take place, though, within Myanmar in order to have a safe, voluntary and dignified return?
Well, the eradication of the military would need to take place first, or at least they need to be contained. The civil representation or the civilian government would need to be back in power. And in this case, we are in support of the NUG, as much as we are critical of them not doing enough on the Rohingya cause. And once the NUG is back in power, we would actually need the citizenship law to be revoked, for Rohingya to actually be able to, one of the conditions that I think would be the most important is to be able to return back to where we used to be. At least the land is still there, even if the houses and the structures that we left behind may have been burnt down and bulldozed. Those places should still belong to us, and there needs to be a process to ensure that Rohingya can go back, and not to go back into facility, not to go back into another internment camp situations like the ones that exist in Sittwe, in Rakhine State.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Some excellent points, and I'll be summarising those at the end. I want to now turn to Dr. Priya Pillai. It's a great pleasure to have you. We heard earlier from the ambassador about the importance role of the ASEAN states. So I mentioned also, multiple international justice proceedings ongoing. Priya, tell us, from your viewpoint, what more could be undertaken within the region, either from legal or political aspects? Welcome.
Thank you, Antonia. And I first just want to thank the Permanent Mission of Bangladesh and Law for hosting this panel and for the invitation with this distinguished group of speakers. It's always inspiring to hear Yasmin speak as well, and Ambassador Rahman. So, I'll pull on some of what they've said as well. But I think, Antonia, to address your question, and I think this is really that critical intersection where we're talking about repatriation, we're talking about international justice, and what are the things that we need to think of from also a regional perspective. I think I'll make a few macro points and then look at political and legal points and specific points that maybe we can explore further. I think the first point that I would make is, and Ambassador Rahman has said this already, the resolution of the crisis. The solution lies in Myanmar. And I think that is something that we need to remember. And I think part of that solution is in ensuring accountability. Now, the roots of the current situation really lie in impunity enjoyed by the military junta, and that needs to be addressed as well, while we think of issues of repatriation and a safe and dignified and voluntary return as well. I think in terms of the regional perspective, there needs to be more regional action from ASEAN, of course, but also from other neighbors in keeping the pressure on, whether this is by economic measures, whether it's by joint sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, political pressure, trade relations. All the neighbors in this region have a lot of relationships with the Myanmar junta as well. And I think they need to bring that pressure to bear on the Myanmar military in a more effective and more forceful manner. I think the other point that I would raise, and this is sort of a more macro point, but I think it's important for the region at large, which informs the way that the region reacts to this crisis, is a respect for humanitarian treaties and norms, including that of non-refoulement, that those who are in danger cannot be set back, and support for refugees fleeing persecution. Many of our regional organizations do not sort of focus on this enough. And I think when we're talking about international justice, this does not form enough of part of the discussion as well in hearing what the community wants. So I think this needs to be an integral and broader discussion as well, which will inform the region more generally. And linked to that, I think, is also a more conducive environment in the region in general to ensure justice and accountability for mass atrocities such as this by a range of measures. So this would include domestic respect for human rights. It would include signature and ratification of international treaties, including the Rome Statute. And I will say that the Asian region is the region that has the lowest ratification of the Rome Statute. So I think that's something that we need to, reflect on and engage with quite seriously as one of the means that we can use to solve some of these issues. Now, those are a few macro points, but I think specifically on this situation, what I would say politically is we need to keep the pressure on the UN Security Council for a full referral to the International Criminal Court. This is because this would provide a full picture of the atrocities against the Rohingya, not just the narrow remit that the ICC has before it currently due to jurisdiction, on the territory of Bangladesh, and would encompass the current situation in Myanmar as well. So I think that's an important point, that given the geopolitical realities, we still need to press forward on this and we can't give up on that. And I think the other point politically, I would say, is more robust ASEAN and neighboring state engagement. The 5-point consensus of ASEAN doesn't seem to be working. And so we need to rethink the engagement and what pressure to apply. I think Cambodia today, I think the foreign minister has come out with a statement, in the course of the last week, talking about potential consequences for Myanmar. There seems to be a rising exasperation with Myanmar, but this is not translating into concrete action by ASEAN, which is a significant regional bloc in this region and needs to step up and do more, I think. I think coming to the question of legal issues that we're thinking about and some of the solutions, in terms of the case at the International Court of Justice, as we know today, the United States has issued a declaration saying it will intervene in the Ukraine case. Now, there's been a lot of discussion on the interventions for the Gambia versus Myanmar. And so far we have, I think, 4 interventions: Netherlands, Canada, Maldives, and the United Kingdom quite recently. I think it works as signaling a show of support. And there are a number of states that have intervened in the Ukraine case. It signals seriousness, state support for the proceedings. The caveat is it might slow proceedings, however. So perhaps an indication of support without intervention may also be sufficient. But I think we need to see that. And I think that, we haven't seen that enough. And it's been really the Gambia sort of leading the charge at the International Court of Justice. So I think legally, that's one of the issues that I would raise. The other that I would raise is, of course, the International Criminal Court. The authorization of the investigation happened in November 2019. There was a recent visit by the ICC prosecutor in February 2020 to Bangladesh, and it seems to indicate some progress, along with this greater cooperation with the ICC, which I think states in the region need to be facilitating and need to be sort of more engaged with. I think there's possibly a need for greater progress and information from the court on what stage and what are the next steps and when can the community see potential indictments, or where are the proceedings right now. The sort of last point on the legal issues that I would raise is there's growing interest in universal jurisdiction cases. What I would say is, particularly for the region, there is a need to tread a bit carefully with this because there are many legal and political aspects to take into account prior to initiating cases under this principle. But I think there is need for a more robust and a much more nuanced assessment of which jurisdictions are more favorable in Asia and elsewhere. And I think this is really important work. And this is something that the Coalition Secretariat is also focused on in quite a significant and serious manner. So I think I'll leave it at that, but there are a number of sort of intersecting issues that we can discuss further, but I'll stop here.
Thanks so much, Priya. And I forgot to mention that you are the head of the Asia Justice Coalition, in case people don't know. So building on that and what you've already told us, and thank you for the excellent suggestions. I mean, what more could an organisation like yours do, or what more could civil society organisations? A question we're always asked: what more could they do?
But that's sort of a big question, Antonia, and I'll try to sort of answer it in brief and with just a few points that I'll highlight. I think, there are many different aspects for civil society to focus on. And I would emphasize that in all these, the needs of those who are affected need to be centered on, and they need to be actively involved. So I think that's the sort of bottom line. And I think that's where we all start from. And I think that's crucial, but it is important to say that again and to emphasize that. I think on civil society engagement and work, we can't all do everything. And I think there is a need for greater and better coordination and working towards specific outcomes as well. And that's, part of the coalition, Raison d'etre as well, part of, why law is also engaged in the coalition, as well as many other actors. So I think that's something that we are sort of consciously trying to do, and sort of to delineate areas and delineate what are the issues that we want to tackle, so that we're not all sort of trying to do the same thing and perhaps not ending up with as effective a result. I think a few points that I would really highlight in terms of civil society engagement. I think the first is humanitarian needs of refugees and sustainable, durable solutions. As Yasmin said, safe, dignified, voluntary returns, truly voluntary returns. And this would ensure including the right conditions for repatriation, such as citizenship laws and all other associated rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural as well. In addition to advocacy for education and training of refugee communities wherever they may be, while they sort of wait for the right conditions for repatriation. The one other point that I would like to raise is, support for people in Myanmar currently, given the situation with the coup, and a specific reference to some of the lawyers who are engaged in really dangerous work currently in Myanmar right now in protecting people's civil liberties, and who are increasingly being detained and arrested themselves. I'll just refer to, our colleagues at the ICJ, another member of the coalition, last week wrote as part of our symposium, which of course Law also contributed to, talking about the need to protect lawyers in Myanmar currently. There are 27 who've been arrested and detained, and they're playing a critical role in times of crisis. They're safeguarding rights, they're documenting, they're playing a protection humanitarian role, and they need help with security protocols, with material support, advocacy support, and legal assistance. So I think that's one group of people that we do need to think about quite seriously, in how they're managing with this rule of law crisis to function within Myanmar as well. And the last 2 points I would just say very briefly: advocacy and pressure on ASEAN and neighboring states is important. Regional efforts should include the entire region, China, India, not just the ASEAN states, as well as engaging with other states that might be able to bring pressure to bear, and civil society organizations. And the last point would be just on business interests. There are significant business interests, and I think we need to look quite seriously at the business and human rights angle, and look at the actors that are in this milieu and how they can be influenced and how they can be engaged to maybe change the situation a bit. So it's quite a long list, but I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much. A lot of food for thought. Very grateful that you could join us. And it reminds me that if you do have questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat box, and I will try to kind of incorporate them if we have time at the end. Thank you so much, Priya. Now that brings me to our next speaker. Welcome, Nicholas Kumjian. Of course, I think also you'll know him, who's the head of the Independent Investigative Mechanism on Myanmar, IIMM. It's really good to see you again, Nick. I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. We know that you've got decades of experience as a prosecutor, working in different courts and tribunals. Can you give us an example, a situation where international justice has contributed towards the return of refugees, where accountability has been important? Welcome, over to you. We can't hear you at the moment.
Thank you so much, Antonia, and I really want to thank you, and I particularly want to thank the Bangladesh mission to Geneva for this kind invitation to attend this important event. Actually, there are quite a few examples, because when you're talking about conflict and serious international crimes, so often there's a refugee aspect, and there's an aspect of people being forced from their homes, and the issue of when they can return to their homes. So when I worked on a case involving Darfur, that certainly is the case. In Cambodia, there were millions of refugees for many years in Cambodia before the peace treaty, and they were allowed to return to their homes. Even in Sierra Leone, people were internally displaced from one village to other areas. But the example that I particularly give in this case, in answer to your question, is Bosnia and Herzegovina. So one of the first case I did in my international career involved the mayor of a town called Prijedor. And Prijedor was a ethnically mixed town in what is now Republika Srpska, the northern part of Bosnia, of about 100,000 people. And I prosecuted the mayor of that town, the Serbian mayor of the town, who took over that position. He was the deputy mayor when there was more or less a coup, and the Serbian faction got rid of what was the largest plurality faction, which were the Muslims of Bosnia. And many of them, Prijedor was quite famous in Bosnia and Herzegovina for the crimes that occurred, for the detention camps, such as the Omarska camp, that were created where people were tortured and many hundreds were killed, eventually thousands killed in Prijedor. So this mayor, Milimir Stakic, he was the mayor also after the peace treaty. And part of the peace treaty, the Dayton Accords, called for the return of refugees. But of course, people were very reluctant. Bosnian Muslims were very reluctant to return to a town where all of the people who had been in power during the conflict, who had constructed these prison camps and these torture chambers, were still in power. The police chief was still there, and Milimir Stakic, the mayor, was there, and others. But at one point, an indictment was announced for the police chief, for Stakic, and for another one of the leaders. And in fact, the police chief was killed resisting arrest. Stakic fled and got away and fled to outside the country, but was arrested a few years later. So I do think that it made a big difference to the people's return. It certainly wasn't an easy process. It wasn't a process without many challenges, many hitches, and I would say it wasn't a complete success, but it certainly was a partial success. Quite a lot of people returned, particularly to one Muslim area, Kozarac in Prijedor. And I think certainly the prosecutions of people like the mayor and others, there were quite a lot of prosecutions by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia of perpetrators from Bosnia and Herzegovina. These had an effect. It would be very hard for people to return to a town where the people that had murdered your relatives are still walking around or sometimes still in power. And again, I wouldn't say that this was a complete success, but it was a partial success. And it definitely, these prosecutions were one factor contributing to the return. There certainly were others. In the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was an international peace enforcement force present on the territory, and still present, enforcing the peace treaty. But prosecutions and the end of impunity, I think, certainly had an effect. It had an effect immediately in allowing people to feel a little more confident so that they would return to places and believe that they would be safe. And I think it also had it's contributing in a long-term way to helping establish the truth of what happened to future generations, hopefully being more aware of what caused this mass exodus and the conflict that affected all sides in that case and killed so many people. So I do think that international justice and the end of impunity can be one important factor. It can't guarantee return, but it's one important factor to contribute to creating the safe conditions that can lead to a dignified and voluntary return.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that example as well. And because we've heard this, it's such an important issue. How can people return? when there are ongoing violations within Myanmar. And to date, no one has been held accountable. Nick, I want to broaden it a little bit further. Knowing the situation in Myanmar, that, you know, as you do, and this long-standing impunity that we've heard of and we all know of, but also now we've heard from Priya that 27 lawyers have been detained who are trying to undertake work within Myanmar, important work. I mean, is there anything more that can be undertaken to support justice processes domestically within Myanmar, in your opinion?
Well, there's a lot of course, potential international assistance to domestic processes. And that is, I think, a growing trend that countries want to prefer to contribute to domestic processes rather than creating international mechanisms. And frankly, the main reason for that, I think, is cost, because the international mechanisms have been very expensive. But of course, that requires political will on the domestic side, willingness to cooperate and a desire to reform and to have real processes and real accountability. But where that does exist, or when that does exist, there are many examples of international assistance to domestic processes to increase their capacity. There also are quite a few examples of mixed international mechanisms where international court exists within the domestic system, or is a hybrid court where it's a mix of domestic and international. And that was the case, for example, with the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia that had Cambodian judges and international judges, prosecutors, international prosecutors. Also, there was established in Bosnia and Herzegovina the state court, which I worked at also in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which again, in the beginning, had a mix of international judges and national judges and international prosecutors working along with domestic prosecutors. And that was phased out over some years, but I think there was some value in the transfer of skills and knowledge, and also in, hopefully, in achieving some confidence of different groups that the courts, the prosecutors and judges weren't simply following their own agenda based on their ethnicity, because there were mixed panels and also internationals involved in the decisions.
Thank you so much for your excellent comments. And, you know, it reminds us that there are many lessons that we can learn from different contexts. Each situation is unique, but certainly there are experiences from the past that can assist us looking to the future. Thank you so much for joining us. And last but absolutely not least, of course, Ambassador Haq, and I think, of course, you all know as the former Foreign Secretary of Bangladesh, we're delighted that you have joined us, and thank you for your patience. Now, you have decades of experience of negotiating and discussions with Myanmar on the Rohingya issue. What, in your opinion, could member states do to further apply pressure on Myanmar to create an environment that would be conducive for Rohingyas to be able to return? A warm welcome to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Before I come and sort of reflect on what the member states and international community could do to put more pressure on the Myanmar, let me sort of share, because we are talking about the repatriation now, repatriation of today. The situation in Myanmar today and the situation in 2017 when the major exodus took place, certainly not the same. So that we have to possibly keep in the context to better understand the repatriation scenario. Because when we were negotiating a bilateral agreement with the Myanmar government, things were absolutely different. Now, what that has happened over the last couple of years? Number one, there was a coup. But the military for the first time realized that they are not in control of the whole country. So their coup actually has not been successful. And I don't think the Myanmar military has ever foreseen that there will be an opposition force building up of the ethnicity which they represent, which is the Bama. So for the first time, Bamas are against Bamas. That's a different dynamics, I think, number one. Number two, I think the ASEAN, because you're talking about the member states, and it looks like that we have given responsibility, we means the international community, the ASEAN, to deal with it. And ASEAN have realized that there is not much that they could either do with the military in place in Myanmar. That's very sure. I think ASEAN governments, including Cambodia, becoming frustrated. Even their very light 5 points is not being respected by the military government. So that's the international community. You know, if ASEAN cannot have a dent on one of the member states, who else could have? Because they are so interlinked in terms of their relations and economy. So that's one. Now, what's happening also in the Northern Rakhine is, as my information go, is in control of Arakan army. They're always there. No, I cannot reveal some of the things that we were privy to earlier when I was foreign secretary, but I can tell you that Arakan army is in almost full control of Northern Rakhine. Whether the Myanmar military has let it happen or not, that I don't know. But now the Myanmar military is trying to regain the Northern Rakhine from the Arakan army, and that creating an instability in our region. And you know that some of the mortar shells and the rest of it was landing on our soil. Our Bangladesh border security forces are keeping a very close eye. Things are not very normal on the other side of it. So that's there's the second or third. What's happening to the Rohingyas? Those who will hopefully one day will return. They're getting restless. There's a growing number of young populations having nothing to do other than sitting for the whole day. So that's creating an uncertainty. That's creating a huge kind of issue and concern for Bangladesh, not only for the government of Bangladesh, but also their neighbors who are non-Rohingyas and staying next to each other. So this is the context within which we are ending up talking the repatriation. And when Yasmin mentioned that it's unlikely to happen today, I fully agree that repatriation is unlikely to happen until and unless there's a major change in Myanmar. And what I mean by major change is that we often say that every country has a military and Myanmar military has a country. So that scenario need to be changed. As long as that's there, I don't think there will be a substantive sort of a progress in terms of repatriation or resolution of the issue. Now, since you have asked me to talk about the member states, now when we talk about the member states, who are there, geopolitically speaking? It's China, it's India, it's Bangladesh, and the ASEAN countries. They're in the close vicinity. Now, Myanmar has always been a geopolitical battleground for major powers, whether in the Second World War between Japan, Japanese forces and the British forces. Before that, after that, it has also been a listening post for the neighbors, the big neighbors. So we recently see a significant change in the Indian policy towards the issue. I think recently the Indian Foreign Secretary was on record suggesting that now they think that repatriation is the only solutions, and they will do all-out efforts, which they never said in the past. They will make all efforts to make it happen. So that indicates that that there are things, I think, coming into consideration of the Indian government which possibly have been made in the past. Talking with the Chinese has always been engaged. They wanted to do something, but not really. I think without making a big issue, I think their interest has fizzled out. I think they think that as long as the military is there, they're better off. So that's the other equation. So this is the international community that we're talking about, and we know whenever things go to the Security Council, It is China and Russia who opposes it. So there's not much hope in the Security Council mechanism. That brings me to the whole issue of the Western world, America and the Europeans. America has finally, it took what? 4 or 5 years for them to declare that genocide has happened. I knew that they were ready 2018 to declare it. They haven't, because the system didn't allow it. So finally, at least they have said that, yes, we know that it's not ethnic cleansing, it's a genocide. So that's a very positive, and they have always been engaged, but they're not as engaged as they could have been. Let me also clear. On the European side, yes, but very, very limited. And gradually, we are also witnessing a sort of a dropping the ball, less and less attention by the Western world on Myanmar issue. So it is basically the regional superpowers, big powers, the ASEAN and Bangladesh is left to deal with the Rohingyas, and in that situation, it's likely to be almost a stalemate for next couple of years. Now, coming to the national unity government, yes, I'm sure that the government of Bangladesh informally and formally has been in touch with them. I know they have been also interest. The member of the national unity government has reached out to Bangladesh civil society in many ways. Now they have now come out with a very clear position on Rohingya. I wish they could have did this in 2016, 15, 17, 18. We have attached huge faith to Madam Aung San Suu Kyi. She has terribly failed Rohingyas, terribly failed us, and we hope that the Burma National Unity Government will realize that what mistake they have done, and for which it is not only the Rohingyas who are suffering, it is also the whole region is getting unstable. I mean, it's not only economically, but politically and geopolitically unstable. So we could have possibly spared these people of the suffering had the Myanmar political government, the daughter and son of democracy, could have realized that doing atrocities against any ethnic minorities is not a nice thing to do. But never, always, better late than never. They have now realized, hopefully, once they come back to power, they will live up to the expectation of the Rohingya community in terms of citizenship or rest of it. At least they have put in writing that. And I'll end with one of my own frustration. I have been present in The Hague when the first hearing was made from the both sides, and I was literally falling out of the chair when Aung San Suu Kyi was defending her military. That was the last thing that I could hear from a Nobel Peace Prize winner, but that was the reality. I hope she would have understood what she is doing at that time wasn't very humane. Forget about the rest of it. I'm not bringing in the human rights issues. Things could have been different. Still, we have time. Hopefully, things will change. But as long as the military continue to be in power with all the investments coming from the Western world, we have a regular monitoring as to who invested which, and we know over the last 2-3 years, investment has gone by 230 times for some countries. So as long as you continue to give oxygen to the military in terms of investment, in terms of business, I don't know what will happen. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We have come to time, but I'm going to ask everybody if we can just take another 5 minutes just to wrap up. Yes, I see heads nodding. Thank you. I'll just briefly, very briefly, Ambassador, before we leave you, you mentioned that moment in The Hague. I remember being there in The Hague, yes, but as other international justice processes ongoing, what would you like to see? What would be the outcome for you that you will be waiting for?
There's one area that Bangladesh has been emphasizing. Our Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has made it very clear in 2017 in the UNG and 2018 in the UNG, said that we have a doctrine called responsibility to protect. Could the international community come together to do something in the Northern Lakan? That was a huge possibility. We had initial discussions with the UN system, but UN is UN. We gradually see UN need to be seen nowhere when really there's a demand for UN to be more active. So in this case also they failed. That is one area that we could try out if there is a consensus and try and build an area for the Rohingyas to go back in safety and security and continue to monitor that. Without that, even if the military are not unlikely to go anywhere, they'll always be there, whoever comes, and the Burma community creates a kind of a government all by themselves, leaving out all the ethnic minorities in future. It's highly unlikely that the Rohingyas will feel comfortable to go back. So that could be one area that possibly we could look at. I know it has a mixed kind of history of R2P, but we could also try that. We were ready to support that in 2017 and 2018. When say we mean government of Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've greatly benefited from having your comprehensive and excellent remarks. Now, just before we close, I'd like to ask each panelist less than a minute, any final words, final comments that you'd like to say before we close. And we're going to start with Yasmin.
Thank you. My final word is this. Any process of repatriation, any process that has to do with our lives, any process that have to do with our future should be determined by a Rohingya community, by ourselves. Without us being informed, without us being involved, without us being given the information that we need and the resources that we need, we would end up here again. And I plead to the international community to actually take this case seriously, because we see the widespread of violence after the genocide took place. And we want this to end, really. We really hope this end here.
Thank you, Yasmin. We hear those pleas. Let's move to Priya.
Thanks, Antonia. I would just focus on the international justice component. I know there's a lot of frustration. It's a series of long processes, in particular, if you look at the International Court of Justice. So I think the messaging around what is happening in these processes is really important, including for the community specifically, for them to know the ins and outs and the time that it might take, but also potentially what is reasonable as an outcome. What would it mean to have a case move forward at the ICC? What would it mean for the ICJ to come out with a judgment, indicating a violation of the Genocide Convention? So I think these are very complex questions, but I think there needs to be communication and messaging around them more effectively and clearly. And what I would just say as a last bit of hope is, we've looked at cases from Latin America that have taken 30 years to come to prosecutions. You've looked at, if you look at Guatemala, you look at El Salvador, we've got many instances where it is a long road and it is a hard path, but there are results at the end of it. But I think we do have to be patient in some of these cases and sort of continue working towards some of these outcomes.
Absolutely. Thanks, Priya. And I know I've heard Nicholas Kumchian say that before, that the road to justice is long. And on that note, Nick, any final comments? We can't hear you.
Yes, I very much appreciate Priya's remarks. I agree entirely. It's a long process and it requires a commitment, a sustained commitment from all of us to achieve the results. But just one bit of hope. things are happening now. And particularly this ICJ case is actually moving for those of us that are trying to collect the evidence that could be useful, it's moving quite quickly. So the brief of Myanmar is due on April 24th, and probably there will be some reply. So, we need to be sustained in our efforts. We need to be committed and recognize that this process is moving, but it's likely to take some time. And we appreciate all those that want to cooperate with us in trying to collect the evidence that could be used in various processes so that someday there is accountability.
Thank you so much. And absolutely, I mean, who would have thought 5 years, we took 5 years back, that we would have these multiple international justice proceedings underway? I don't think that was foreseen. So there is some hope. Thank you for reminding us of that. Ambassador Hack, some last comments from you.
Yes, when the international community is trying to bring in justice for the Rohingyas, the place where these things are happening has always been very volatile. I hope that geopolitically speaking, it doesn't blow up in terms of instability. It continue to remain as it is, but there are possibilities that this area could also be could become unstable, and that will involve multiple countries, big countries. In Bangladesh would possibly have to take the maximum heat if it really blows up. So the international community should ensure that it never becomes another hotspot in terms of geopolitical rivalry. Thank you.
Thank you so much today. What a rich discussion. Just before we close, I'm just going to summarize some of the things that we have heard, and we will be circulating them as well. We've heard that dialogue is required with Myanmar despite the difficult political situation. We need continuous pressure also on Myanmar. We've heard about joint sanctions, business and human rights issues we need to be looked at, not only from within the region, but also from superpowers. They need to take more action. Also that Rohingya need to have information if they are going to return, and they need to be part of that discussion. We heard a plea for vocational trainings within the camp, also that there would have to be a change of power, we heard today, and including the NUG back in power, and that the citizenship law would need to be revoked in order to return. Also, again and again, they have to address the ongoing and long-standing impunity for crimes. And we heard very clearly that in other situations in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Darfur and Cambodia, prosecutions matter. Accountability matters for individuals in order to contribute towards their return. Keeping on international justice, we want to see that ICC investigation moving forward and updates. Could there be a referral to the ICC on the situation of Myanmar? The International Court of Justice case is moving forward, but we've seen in the situation of Ukraine and the ICJ case, many more member states making their declarations of their intention to intervene. Let's see that as well on that case. And also multiple and more cases using the principles of extraterritorial and universal jurisdiction, noting that we have to tread carefully as well. Civil society play an important role, not only in international justice, but also in advocacy and also supporting humanitarian needs, not only within Bangladesh, but also in Myanmar, and a reminder of those lawyers in Myanmar that are being detained and their important role, and we need to support them. And also that the UN has an important role to play not only now, but if there was to be a return, to monitor that, to ensure protection as well. I thank you hugely, not only to our incredible panelists for joining us, but all of those who joined us today. Thank you so much for joining. That brings us to a close, and I wish you all a wonderful weekend. Take care, everybody. Thank you. And bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.